Welcome to today's episode, where we'll explore the story of Polk and Posey, leaders of the last serious Native American uprising in the United States. This tale takes us to the early 20th century in southeastern Utah, where a band of renegade Utes defied the federal government for years. Our story begins in May 1914, when the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in Washington received an alarming telegram. Claude C. Covey, superintendent of the Navajo Springs Indian Agency in southwestern Colorado, reported the discovery of a Mexican man's body on the reservation. Evidence pointed to murder, with a Ute Native American as the prime suspect. This incident marked the beginning of a 7-year period filled with outrages, battles, arrests, and escapes. The situation would escalate to the point where U.S. cavalry intervention was considered, ending only with the death of one of the main leaders. Thank you for joining your desert frontiersman, Alan. Please leave a like or comment. Hit the subscribe button for more desert adventures. To understand the context, let's look at the history of the Ute people. When Spanish explorer Escalante discovered them around the time of the American Revolution, they were warrior people, wild and roving. Their primary enemies were the Navajo to the south. They lived by hunting and gathering. As white settlers pushed into their territory, their tribe and their cousins, the Paiutes, were forced into inhospitable canyon lands. This harsh environment couldn't support their traditional lifestyle, and they became impoverished, living in brush and mud huts, subsisting on grasshoppers, vegetation, and sometimes reptiles. The arrival of white settlers brought horses and livestock to the region. The Ute tribe, Paiutes, and Navajo began acquiring stock. While the Navajo became relatively wealthy with large flocks, the Ute tribe and Paiutes remained more primitive and untamed. Although reservations were established, many Ute tribesmen preferred to roam the isolated plateaus and canyons, far from government supervision. These roving bands became a nuisance to white stockmen and farmers. Fear of a Native American uprising led whites to treat them cautiously, which some Native Americans interpreted as weakness. The boldest became renegades, stealing stock and living outside the law. From their perspective, they had never made a treaty with the whites and considered themselves a sovereign nation. They were simply living where their ancestors had always lived, adhering to the harsh law of survival their environment had taught them. Among these renegade bands, 3 leaders emerged: Mancos Jim, Old Polk, and Posey. Their actions would build enmity with their neighbors that would eventually lead to their downfall. Returning to 1914 after receiving Covey's telegram, the Indian Affairs Office gathered sworn testimonies. One Native American, Covey's son, testified that he had encountered Polk's son on the road. Polk's son, also known as Tse-na-gat or Everett Hatch, had asked about a Mexican man and declared his intention to kill him for his money. Even more damning was the testimony of young cattle herders. They reported hearing gunshots and seeing a man, identified as Tse-na-gat, apparently disposing of a body. When they investigated, they found the dead Mexican. The witnesses admitted they hadn't reported the incident immediately, fearing Tse-na-gat and his father, Old Polk, known as dangerous men. With this evidence, it seemed to be an open and shut case. The challenge was arresting Tse-na-gat, who had fled to the hills with his father. Agent Covey first tried to persuade them to surrender peacefully, but they turned back before reaching the reservation. Covey then requested a U.S. Marshal serve a warrant on the Ute. However, when a deputy marshal encountered the group, he didn't attempt to serve the warrant, fearing violence. Meanwhile, Old Polk and his band wandered the countryside, confident their threats would deter any arrest attempts. Lorenzo D. Creel, a special agent working with scattered Native American bands in Utah, visited Tse-na-gat and was impressed with the young man. He considered Tse-na-gat mild-mannered, but viewed Old Polk as an all-round bad Indian. Creel estimated Polk's followers numbered about 25 Ute and Paiute tribesmen. For months, tension simmered, but it seemed major conflict might be avoided. However, in February 1915, the situation escalated dramatically. Indian Commissioner Caddo Sells ordered Creel to assist U.S. Marshal Nebeker in arresting the wanted men, who now included Old Posey along with Polk and Tse-na-gat. On February 21, 1915, the first clash occurred. Marshal Nebeker had organized a posse of 20 men and located the renegades hidden in Combe Wash. The posse surrounded the camp before sunrise, but the Native Americans opened fire, killing one posse member. The posse returned fire, killing one Native American. The battle lasted 2 hours. During the night, the posse scattered the warriors and captured some. However, the leaders, Polk, Tse-na-gat, and Posey, escaped. It's believed they may have used Old Posey's secret getaway route, a hidden trail leading up an apparently unscalable 2,000-foot sandstone escarpment. Posey's knowledge of the terrain and seemingly miraculous escapes had made him both feared and admired. The situation remained tense in the following days. Citizens demanded immediate government action. Peaceful Native Americans were terrified, fearing they would be the first targets if Polk and Posey's band attacked. The outlaws themselves were in dire straits, their horses dead or dying, facing harsh winter conditions with little food, inadequate clothing, and minimal shelter. The weather hampered both sides. Roads were impassable except on horseback, and communication was difficult due to cut or downed telephone lines. The whites had to navigate unfamiliar terrain cautiously, while the Native Americans knew the land intimately. By late February, the combined bands of Polk and Posey had grown to over 100 people, though this number was constantly reduced by surrenders and the toll of exposure. The fugitives had crossed the San Juan River and entrenched themselves north of the Navajo reservation, preparing for a final stand. As tensions rose, there were calls for military intervention. Instead of sending cavalry, the government dispatched Brigadier General Hugh L. Scott to take charge and find a solution. The first breakthrough came on March 11th, when Mrs. Wetherill, wife of a famous Navajo trader, inquired about possible terms for Polk and his son's surrender. Largely due to her efforts on March 20th, Tse-na-gat, Polk, Posey, and Posey's son surrendered to General Scott at Mexican Hat. All except Tse-na-gat were taken to Salt Lake City, tried, acquitted, and returned to the Navajo Springs Reservation, under conditions of good conduct and a promise to remain there. Tse-na-gat was taken to Denver to be tried for the murder of Juan Chacon, the Mexican man. Interestingly, despite the evidence against him, Tse-na-gat convinced General Scott, Agent Creel, and Superintendent Jenkins of his innocence. Public sentiment grew in his favor, particularly after he was moved from jail to a hospital for tuberculosis treatment. With excellent legal aid, Tse-na-gat was acquitted on July 15, 1915, and returned to the reservation. However, the story was far from over. Old Polk, Posey, and their bands had promised to settle on the reservation, but they only stayed briefly before resuming their nomadic lifestyle. The next few years saw ongoing conflicts between the renegade bands and white settlers. Some actions were marked by extreme cruelty, with cattle found mutilated or beaten to death. Posey seemed to have replaced Polk as the leader of these outrages. Now, around 50 years old, Posey was at the height of his notoriety. His repeated escapes from danger had led him to boast, "Me all same Jes Christ, white man's bullets no can hit." The situation simmered until early 1923, when two young Native Americans from Posey's band, Joe Bishop's boy and Shanup's boy, raided a sheep camp. When a warrant was issued for their arrest, Posey refused to give them up. After negotiations, it was arranged for the boys to surrender in Blanding. They were tried and found guilty in the local justice court, with the intention of passing a light sentence of about 10 days in jail. However, Utah law required a 6-hour gap between conviction and sentencing. During this time, as the sheriff was taking the boys into custody, they attempted to escape. Joe Bishop's boy managed to grab the sheriff's gun, but it failed to fire when he pulled the trigger. In the ensuing chaos, both young men escaped into a crowd of Native Americans and fled town on waiting ponies. A car chase and then a horseback pursuit ensued, with gunfire exchanged between the posse and the fleeing Native Americans. They retreated to a high, narrow plateau southwest of Blanding, a place difficult to access and seemingly easily defensible. A siege began, with gunfire exchanged throughout the afternoon. Joe Bishop's boy was killed in the fighting, shot between the eyes as he was taking aim at a deputy. The plateau was surrounded by nightfall, and the posse worked its way to the top during the night. The siege continued through the second day, with little firing. By the second night, overwhelmed by the posse's numbers, the Native Americans agreed to surrender. However, when account was taken of the prisoners, one notable figure was missing. Old Posey had somehow escaped again, slipping through the besiegers' lines during the second night. It was later discovered that he had been badly wounded in the escape. More than a month passed with no word of the old renegade. Then a cryptic telegram arrived in Washington. Today's secured body of William Posey. Found him dead in mountains near where posse engaged Indians. Old Posey had indeed met his end, but it took more than a bullet to stop him. When his body was exhumed for verification, it was discovered that he had been shot low in the back and had died from gangrene. The last of the Warpath Indians in the United States had fallen. But even in death, Posey remained a figure of mystery and legend. His band later reburied his body far up Mule Creek Canyon, in a location known only to his closest and most loyal followers. In the end, the saga of Polk and Posey represents the closing chapter of armed indigenous resistance in the United States. It marked the transition to a new era in Native American history, one characterized by different forms of advocacy and cultural preservation. Today, the landscapes where these events took place remain much as they were a century ago, rugged, beautiful, and full of hidden canyons and towering mesas. For those who know the story, these lands carry the echoes of that final conflict, a testament to a turbulent past and the enduring spirit of those who called this harsh country home. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a fascinating and often overlooked chapter of American history. May it inspire us to look more deeply into the stories that shape our world and to seek greater understanding of the diverse experiences that make up our shared human story. Please leave a like or comment. For more desert romps, hit the subscribe button.